In desperation, I let a homeless woman watch my 5 kids, but everything changed when she saw that photo. The rain was coming down so hard that the headlights from passing cars looked like melted butter streaks across a charcoal sky. The wind cut through my denim jacket like it was tissue paper, and I pressed the white pharmacy bag closer to my chest. Inside were the last antibiotics I could afford for my youngest, Camden. His fever had spiked to 103 degrees that morning, and I still had 3 days until my next paycheck from the diner. Back home, our refrigerator held nothing but a half-empty carton of milk, 4 slices of Wonder Bread, and the remnants of last night's mac and cheese. 5 kids waiting in our cramped apartment with a broken furnace and too much worry hanging in the air like smoke. This damn storm felt like the universe's cruel joke. I stepped off the curb at Maple Street, glancing left and right through the sheets of rain. The crosswalk was empty, just wet asphalt gleaming under the streetlights. My sneakers hit the painted lines just as an engine roared around the corner. Headlights blazed into view, blinding white and getting bigger by the second. I froze. For one heart-stopping moment, my feet wouldn't move. My mind went completely blank except for the image of Camden's flushed little face, burning with fever, calling out Mama in that raspy voice that had been haunting me all day. Then someone grabbed my arm hard, yanking me backward with surprising strength. The black pickup truck thundered past, sending a wave of dirty street water up to my knees. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, gasping, the pharmacy bag somehow still clutched against my chest. I turned to see who had saved me. She was elderly, maybe 70-something, with silver hair escaping from a navy blue knit cap. Her wool coat was threadbare and soaked at the hem, and her striped scarf looked like it had seen better decades. But she stood perfectly straight, with a kind of posture that spoke of old-fashioned manners and inner steel. Her eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, like winter sky, and they looked at me with the calm intensity of someone who just pulled me from a burning building. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked. Her voice was soft but firm, not the polite concern of a stranger, but the practiced worry of someone who'd spent years caring for others. I opened my mouth to say I was fine, but the words stuck somewhere between embarrassment and leftover terror. "Yeah, thank you. I didn't see it coming. My son's sick, and I trailed off, realizing I was babbling to a complete stranger in the middle of a storm. She smiled, just a gentle curve of her lips. No harm done. But rushing across like that, life isn't something we can replace, dear." I nodded, still shaking from the close call. The bus shelter was just a few steps away, and we both headed toward it without speaking. We sat together on the damp wooden bench, the wind howling at our backs through the gap in the plexiglass walls. She didn't say much at first, just stared out into the grey curtain of rain like she was reading something invisible to the rest of us. I should have thanked her properly and left. Should have hurried home to Camden. Instead, I found myself telling her everything. I told her about Camden's high fever and how the emergency room visit had eaten up my grocery money for the week. About my oldest, Blake, trying to step up as the man of the house since David died in that construction accident 2 years ago. About missing shifts at Murphy's Diner because I couldn't find anyone to watch the kids. And about our babysitter, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd moved to Florida last month without warning. I even told her about the constant ache in my chest, not physical, but something deeper, that twisted tighter every time I had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying milk. She listened without interrupting. Didn't check her phone or fidget or look away. Just listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like my words actually mattered. When I finally ran out of steam, she looked at me with those pale blue eyes and said the last thing I expected. "I could help," she said simply, "with your children. I'm good with little ones. Used to teach for 37 years. No pay needed. I just need a place to stay and maybe a reason to get up in the morning." I blinked at her. Was she serious? A homeless woman offering to babysit my kids? Every maternal instinct I had started screaming warnings. This was exactly the kind of situation they made Lifetime movies about. But her voice wasn't desperate or scheming. It was measured, clear. Her eyes didn't dart around like someone running a con. They held steady as granite. "My name's Dorothy," she added, as if that explained everything. I should have said no. Any reasonable mother would have said no. But something deep inside me, maybe exhaustion, maybe instinct, maybe just the memory of how gently she'd pulled me from danger, whispered yes. The walk home took 15 minutes through the winding streets of our neighborhood. 6 blocks of cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences, past the corner market with its flickering neon sign and the old Methodist church where David and I got married. The storm was finally letting up, leaving behind that clean, washed smell that made everything feel possible. I unlocked the door to our second-floor apartment and stepped inside, unsure whether I was bringing home salvation or disaster. The living room was exactly as I'd left it, toys scattered across the worn carpet, Blake's algebra homework spread on the coffee table, and the portable heater humming in the corner. But when my kids looked up from the couch where they'd been watching cartoons and saw Dorothy standing there, dripping wet and smiling with a warmth they hadn't seen from a stranger in months, something magical happened. They didn't scream or hide behind me like I'd half expected. Instead, my middle daughter Autumn walked right up to her and offered her a towel. "You're all wet," she said matter-of-factly. "Do you want some hot chocolate? Mama makes it with extra marshmallows." Dorothy's smile grew wider, and for the first time since David's funeral, our apartment felt less like a place we were barely surviving and more like a home where people took care of each other. "Maybe this wouldn't be a disaster after all." "There are shoes everywhere," Dorothy said the next morning, standing in our narrow hallway and surveying the battlefield of sneakers, boots, and flip-flops scattered from the front door to the kitchen. "How do you ever find a matching pair?" I laughed, actually laughed, because the truth was, I didn't. 5 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment meant chaos wasn't just a visitor. It had signed a lease and moved in permanently. But somehow Dorothy moved through our morning madness like she'd choreographed it herself. Not as a guest trying to stay out of the way, but as if she'd always belonged here and we just hadn't noticed. By 10 o'clock, she'd already made scrambled eggs for everyone, taught Autumn how to sort the laundry by colors, calmed Camden's coughing fit with honey and warm milk, and convinced my picky eater, Sage, to eat a whole banana without the usual negotiations. That last one alone felt like witnessing a miracle. When I left for my lunch shift at Murphy's Diner, Dorothy was sitting at our small kitchen table helping Blake with his geometry homework, explaining angles and theorems like she'd been doing it her whole life. I didn't tell anyone at work about Dorothy. What would I even say? I picked up a babysitter from a bus stop last night. Nobody would understand, except maybe Carmen. Carmen Valdez was the kind of coworker you wanted in your corner during the dinner rush. Quick hands, sharp eyes, and a mouth that could cut through customer complaints like a hot knife through butter. We weren't best friends, but we'd worked enough double shifts together that she knew my story, or at least the important parts. "Everything okay with the kids?" she asked while we restocked napkin dispensers before the evening crowd arrived. "Better, actually," I said, wiping down a sticky table. "They have someone home with them now. Someone kind." She glanced up from counting silverware. "You found a sitter." "Something like that." Carmen didn't push for details, but later, as we clocked out, she followed me to the employee parking lot behind the restaurant. "You watch yourself, Renley," she said quietly, car keys jingling in her hand. "The world's full of people who look harmless, especially when you're desperate enough to take risks." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't have words to explain Dorothy. There was something about her, a stillness, like she'd seen enough of life's storms to stay steady in any weather. And in that calmness, there was no hidden darkness or agenda. Just the quiet strength of someone who knew how to weather whatever came next. I came home to the smell of pot roast. Let me say that again, pot roast. With carrots and potatoes and that rich, savory aroma that makes a house feel like a real home instead of just a place where you sleep. I hadn't cooked a full meal in weeks. Between pulling doubles at the diner and Blake's baseball practice schedule, dinner had become whatever I could heat up in the microwave or throw together from cans and boxes. But Dorothy had somehow made it feel like Sunday, even though it was Tuesday and payday was still 24 hours away. It started with Blake coughing during breakfast, just a small, dry sound that he tried to muffle behind his napkin. Blake had always been my steady one, the reliable child who never complained, never asked for help unless he truly needed it. So when I noticed him sitting too still at the table, his cereal growing soggy while he stared out the window with distant eyes, my stomach dropped. "You feeling okay, sweetheart?" I asked, pressing the back of my hand to his forehead. No fever, but his skin had that pale, translucent quality that meant something was wrong. "I'm fine, Mom," he said quietly. "Just tired." I wanted to believe him. God knows I needed to believe him. But that afternoon, Dorothy pulled me aside in the hallway, her usual calm expression tight with concern. "Blake's breathing seems shallow," she said softly. "And he winced when he sat down after lunch. I don't want to worry you, but I think it might be worth having someone take a look." I didn't hesitate. We were in the pediatric emergency room at Riverside General by 6 o'clock that evening, Blake curled against me on the hard plastic chairs while we waited. The walls were painted that institutional mint green that's supposed to be soothing but always reminded me of old hospitals and bad news. We waited for 3 hours, flu season, overworked nurses, chart after chart being shuffled around like playing cards in a game nobody wanted to win. Finally, they called Blake's name. The triage nurse took his vitals, then blood work, then hooked him up to an EKG machine. The words started coming fast after that: irregular rhythm, needs echo, previous rheumatic fever. I felt the bottom drop out of my world. When he was 7, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But it cleared up. They said he was fine. The nurses exchanged one of those looks, the tight-lipped, worried kind that parents learn to dread. Dr. Patterson, the pediatric cardiologist, was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She sat us down and showed me the ultrasound screen, pointing to shadows and movements I couldn't interpret. Even I could see something was wrong. It's called mitral valve regurgitation, she explained gently. The valve isn't closing properly, so blood flows backward. It's progressed significantly since his last checkup. The words hit me like physical blows. What does that mean? He needs surgery. Soon. How soon? My voice cracked on the question. We'll try to get him scheduled within the next 6 to 8 weeks. I'm sorry, it's not ideal, but our surgical team is backed up. Unless you can transfer him to a private cardiac center, it's going to take time. Time. The one thing I didn't have. The one thing Blake couldn't afford. That night, I barely slept. Blake was back home, exhausted and tucked under extra blankets, while Dorothy sat beside his bed reading softly from Treasure Island. I stood in the doorway watching them, feeling my heart crack open in places I'd forgotten were still vulnerable. In the kitchen, surrounded by the quiet hum of our old refrigerator and the distant sound of Dorothy's gentle voice, I finally fell apart. I didn't fall apart with screams or dramatic sobs. Just quiet tears, the kind you cry into your sleeves because you can't afford to collapse when 5 kids are counting on you to hold everything together. Dorothy found me there a few minutes later. She didn't ask questions or offer empty reassurances. Just handed me a steaming mug of chamomile tea and sat down across from me at our small kitchen table. We'll find a way, she said simply. You're not alone in this. Her words were quiet, but they landed like an anchor in the storm that had been raging inside my chest since we left the hospital. The next morning, after dropping off Blake's new prescriptions and calling in sick to the diner, I sat at the public library's computer trying to navigate hospital websites I couldn't afford. Every page looked the same: waiting lists, specialists, insurance forms that might as well have been written in Latin. Then I remembered something. Dorothy's full name, Dorothy Whitman. I typed it into the search bar, not really expecting anything. But what came up made me catch my breath. Teacher of the Year, Dorothy Whitman, 1994. There was a photo, Dorothy, younger but unmistakably her, standing on a school auditorium stage holding a crystal plaque. And beside her, a teenage boy with dark hair and a shy smile, holding his own award. Christopher Whitman, regional champion, National Academic Decathlon. My heart started racing. I clicked through more results. Christopher Whitman, PhD. Christopher Whitman, published researcher. Christopher Whitman, Associate Professor of American History at Northwestern University. That evening, when I showed Dorothy the printout, her hands trembled as she touched the paper. Her pale blue eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of recognition, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. That's my son, she whispered. Christopher. He loved old books, wanted to be a professor since he was 10 years old. I leaned forward. Do you want to find him? She looked at me with more clarity than I'd ever seen in her expression. Yes. Before it's too late. Christopher Whitman lived in Evanston, Illinois, just over 3 hours from our town. His university profile showed he was a senior researcher in Civil War documentation, with published books and a podcast about historical preservation. His bio mentioned awards, exhibitions, scholarly achievements. It didn't mention a mother. I stared at his faculty photo for a long time. He looked like Dorothy, the same thoughtful eyes, the same determined chin. Just older, more polished, wearing the kind of life that success builds around you. I printed the page, folded it carefully, and handed it to Dorothy over breakfast. I don't want to intrude, I said. But if you're ready, I'll drive you there. Dorothy ran her fingers along the creases of the paper. "He probably thinks I'm dead," she murmured. "If he ever looked for me." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. We left the next morning. Blake kissed Dorothy on the cheek and whispered something in her ear that made her smile. The younger kids waved from our apartment balcony like we were heading off on some grand adventure instead of toward what might be the most important conversation of Dorothy's life. Christopher's house wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of some sterile professor's cottage, it was a restored Victorian painted deep blue with white trim, tucked between oak trees in a quiet neighborhood near the university. Wide front porch, bay windows, and a garden that looked like someone actually cared about making beautiful things grow. Through the front window, I could see floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the warm glow of table lamps. I rang the doorbell, my heart hammering against my ribs. A long pause, then footsteps, then a voice through the intercom. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Whitman," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Renley Hayes. I think I found someone important to you." Another pause. I could hear my own breathing, could feel Dorothy standing perfectly still behind me on the porch steps. The lock clicked. He opened the door slowly, tall, maybe 45, wearing a cardigan and glasses, looking exactly like the kind of professor who'd spend his Saturdays grading papers and drinking coffee from mugs with witty sayings. His eyes scanned me first, then moved to Dorothy, standing quietly on the walkway. He didn't recognize her. Not at first. But then Dorothy took a step forward and said one word, "Cricket." His face changed like someone had flipped a switch inside him. He stepped forward, hesitant, then stopped completely. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Dorothy reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something I'd never seen before, a small silver locket on a tarnished chain. She held it out to him with shaking hands. "I kept this," she said softly, "even when I forgot everything else." He took it, opened it with fumbling fingers, and saw what was inside. A tiny photo of them together, him as a boy, her younger and laughing, both of them squinting in bright sunlight. Then he fell into her arms, and 40 years of separation dissolved like it had never existed. They talked for hours. I left them alone in his study, walls lined with books, old maps, artifacts from a life spent preserving the past, and wandered through his house. The kitchen with its herb garden windowsill, the living room with its comfortable chairs and reading lights, the back deck overlooking a yard where someone had built raised garden beds and a small greenhouse. When Dorothy finally called for me, her voice was stronger than I'd ever heard it. "She remembers," Christopher told me, tears still clinging to his eyelashes. "Not everything, not all at once, but enough. She remembers me." We drove back as the sun set behind rolling farmland, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Dorothy was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not lost or confused, but full. Like a book that had found its missing pages. Blake was waiting when we got home, curled on the couch with a blanket, Dorothy's copy of Treasure Island resting on his chest. His breathing was more labored than when we'd left, his skin paler. "Mom," he said softly when he saw me, "I think I need to go back to the hospital." I nodded, brushing his hair back from his forehead. This time, I knew we wouldn't be waiting alone. The second trip to the emergency room felt different, not in the sterile hallways or the fluorescent lights, but in the knowledge that we weren't facing this crisis alone anymore. Blake's condition had worsened. The valve damage was now classified as severe, requiring immediate surgical intervention. But this time, when Dr. Patterson delivered the news about waiting lists and delayed procedures, Christopher was there with his phone already out, making calls. "I know someone at the University of Chicago Medical Center," he said quietly, scrolling through his contacts. "A colleague whose daughter had the same surgery last year. Let me see what I can do." By morning, he'd arranged everything. Not just an appointment, but admission to a clinical research program that would cover the costs and provide Blake with cutting-edge surgical techniques. The kind of opportunity that would have been impossible for a single mother working at a small-town diner. "I can't repay you for this," I whispered as we sat in the hospital waiting room, watching Blake get prepped for surgery. Christopher looked at me with his mother's steady gaze. "You gave me back 40 years of my life. There's nothing else to say." The surgery was successful. Blake came home a week later with a chest full of healing stitches and a brightness in his eyes that I hadn't seen in months. He moved slower, tired easily, but he smiled more. And when he did, it filled every corner of our small apartment with light. Christopher invited us to stay with him while Blake recovered. Just until he's stronger, he said. But the way he watched my kids exploring his garden, helping Dorothy cook dinner in his spacious kitchen, told a different story. His house wasn't just beautiful, it was alive with curiosity. Wooden shelves held ancient atlases and historical documents. The walls displayed framed maps, photographs from archaeological sites, and artifacts that made my children gasp with wonder. Camden loved the basement workshop where Christopher restored old books. Autumn couldn't stop asking about the telescope on the back deck. Sage discovered a love for the herb garden, carefully watering Christopher's tomatoes and basil like they were precious treasures. Dorothy bloomed in ways I hadn't thought possible. Her blog, The Gentle Teacher, became an online sensation among educators across the country. She shared lesson plans, reflections on literature, and thoughts on kindness that reached thousands of teachers hungry for wisdom and inspiration. Blake started his own YouTube channel about historical exploration, with Christopher as his co-host and biggest supporter. They'd film episodes in the study, surrounded by maps and artifacts, talking about everything from Civil War battles to ancient trade routes. One evening 6 months later, as we sat around Christopher's dining room table, all of us, a family built from circumstance and choice rather than blood, Dorothy looked at me over the candlelight. "Do you ever miss the apartment?" she asked. I thought for a moment, watching my children laugh and argue and belong in this space that had somehow become ours. "No," I said finally. "I miss the fight sometimes, the proof that I could survive anything. But not the fear. Never the fear." Christopher reached for my hand across the table. "Welcome home," he said simply. And for the first time in years, I truly was.